My family forced me into years of therapy for anger issues. Turns out I wasn't the problem, and what I revealed at the final session left them speechless. I, 32M, walked into Dr. Chin's office for what I knew would be my last session after 3 grueling years. My family sat in the cramped waiting room outside, probably rehearsing their usual script about my supposed anger issues and how grateful they should be that therapy had finally fixed me. If only they knew what was coming. The whole thing started when I was 29. I'd been living with my parents temporarily after my divorce, trying to get back on my feet financially. My older brother had moved back home too with his wife and twin daughters after losing his job. The house felt crowded, tensions ran high, and apparently, I was the designated scapegoat for every argument that erupted. It began with small incidents. I'd come home from my 12-hour shifts at the warehouse, exhausted and wanting nothing more than a quiet dinner and some sleep. But the house was always chaos. My brother's kids would be screaming, his wife would be yelling at them, and my mother would be stress cleaning everything in sight while muttering complaints under her breath. When I'd ask for just a little consideration, maybe keeping the noise down after 10 p.m. since I had to be up at 5 a.m., suddenly I was the problem. My father would lecture me about being ungrateful. My mother would cry about how stressful everything was for everyone. My brother would remind me that kids will be kids, and I needed to be more understanding. The breaking point came during a family dinner 6 months into this arrangement. I'd worked 16 hours straight because a coworker called in sick, and I came home to find my brother had eaten the leftovers I'd specifically labeled for myself. When I mentioned I was disappointed because I hadn't eaten all day and was really looking forward to that meal, my sister-in-law exploded. She accused me of being selfish and inconsiderate. She said I was making her husband feel unwelcome in his own childhood home. She claimed I'd been hostile toward her daughters, which was completely untrue. I'd actually been the one taking them to the park and helping with their homework when their parents were too busy arguing with each other. The worst part was watching my family immediately take her side. My mother apologized to her for my behavior. My father told me I needed to learn some respect. My brother just sat there silently while his wife painted me as some kind of monster for wanting to eat the food I'd bought and labeled. That night, my parents sat me down for what they called an intervention. They told me I had serious anger management problems and needed professional help. They'd already found a therapist and made an appointment. If I didn't go, I need to find somewhere else to live immediately. I was trapped. I barely had enough saved for a security deposit on an apartment, and with rent prices in our area, I needed at least 6 more months to accumulate enough for a decent place. So I agreed to therapy, thinking maybe it would help me communicate better with my family. Dr. Chun was actually great. She was patient, insightful, and genuinely seemed to want to help me work through what my family had convinced me were my problems. For months, I talked about my supposed anger issues, my difficulty adjusting to living at home again, and my struggles with feeling misunderstood. But something interesting started happening around month 4. Dr. Chun began asking very specific questions about my family dynamics. She wanted to know more about how conflict started, who said what, and how issues got resolved. She asked me to describe typical days at home, how chores and responsibilities were divided, and how decisions got made. The more we talked, the more I started seeing patterns I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I had noticed them, but convinced myself I was imagining things. Like how every argument somehow became about my attitude, even when I hadn't started it. How my brother never had to contribute to household expenses despite having unemployment benefits, while I was expected to pay rent and help with groceries. How my sister-in-law could scream at her children and slam doors when she was frustrated, but if I so much as sighed heavily after a long day, I was being aggressive. Dr. Chin introduced me to terms I'd never heard before: scapegoating, gaslighting, emotional manipulation, family systems theory. She explained how sometimes families unconsciously designate one member as the source of all problems because it's easier than addressing real issues. By month 8, I was starting to understand that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the problem. Dr. Chun suggested family therapy sessions, but when I brought this up at home, the reaction was immediate and telling. My mother got defensive and asked why we needed family therapy when I was the one with anger issues. My father said they'd already made enough sacrifices supporting my therapy and they weren't about to waste more time and money. My brother claimed he was too busy job hunting to add therapy appointments to his schedule. But the most revealing response came from my sister-in-law. She pulled me aside later that evening and told me she was concerned that I was trying to manipulate the therapist into taking my side against the family. She said she'd heard about people who turned therapy into a weapon against their loved ones, and she hoped I wasn't going down that path. That conversation was a turning point. I realized she was scared of family therapy because she knew exactly what it would reveal. She knew that under professional scrutiny, her behavior toward me, and her role in turning my family against me, would become obvious. I spent the next year carefully documenting everything. Not obsessively, just noting patterns. I started keeping a simple log on my phone of incidents, arguments, and how they got resolved. I paid attention to double standards, inconsistent rules, and who was held accountable for what. The picture that emerged was crystal clear. I was being systematically blamed for problems I didn't create, punished for reactions that were completely normal, and gaslit into believing I was the source of family dysfunction. Meanwhile, my brother's unemployment stretched on with no real effort to find work. He spent most days playing video games or hanging out with friends while his wife grew increasingly resentful and took her frustrations out on everyone around her, especially me, since I was the easiest target. My sister-in-law had effectively turned my parents against me by constantly complaining about my presence in the house. She'd tell my mother I made her uncomfortable. She'd tell my father I was setting a bad example for her daughters. She'd tell my brother I was trying to undermine their marriage by not being supportive enough of their situation. None of it was true, but it was a brilliant strategy. By constantly positioning herself as the victim of my supposed hostility, she'd managed to make herself the family favorite while painting me as the villain. My parents bent over backward to accommodate her comfort while treating me like a problem to be managed. The worst part was how she'd provoke me and then play victim when I responded. She'd make snide comments about my failed marriage, question my work ethic, or criticize my lifestyle choices. When I defend myself or push back even mildly, she'd immediately run to my parents and claim I was being aggressive toward her. Dr. Chen helped me understand that this was a classic manipulation tactic. Create conflict, escalate the situation, then position yourself as the innocent party when the other person reacts. It was so effective because it played into existing family dynamics where I was already seen as the problematic one. As my final session approached, Dr. Chun suggested something that initially made me uncomfortable. She wanted to bring my family in for one session so I could share what I'd learned about myself and our family dynamics. She assured me she'd facilitate the conversation and wouldn't let it turn into another intervention where I got blamed for everything. I was terrified but also curious. After 3 years of being told I was the problem, I wanted to see how my family would react to professional perspective on our situation. My family agreed to the session, probably thinking it would be my therapist telling them I was cured and thanking them for their patience during my healing process. The day of the session, we all sat in Dr. Chen's larger conference room. My parents looked expectant. My brother seemed bored and kept checking his phone. My sister-in-law wore this smug expression like she was about to be vindicated for everything she'd put up with from me. Dr. Chen started by explaining that after 3 years of working with me, she wanted to share some insights about family dynamics and communication patterns. She emphasized that this wasn't about blame, but about understanding how we could all communicate better moving forward. Then she began outlining what she'd observed through my descriptions of our interactions. She talked about scapegoating patterns, emotional triangulation, and how families sometimes unconsciously assign roles that become self-perpetuating. She was diplomatic but clear. I watched my family's faces change as she spoke. My mother started looking confused. My father's expression grew defensive. My brother actually put his phone away and started paying attention. But my sister-in-law's reaction was the most telling. Her smug confidence evaporated and was replaced by something that looked like panic. Dr. Chun then invited me to share what I'd learned about myself and our family dynamics over the past 3 years. This was my moment. I started by acknowledging that I'd come to therapy genuinely believing I had anger management problems. I thanked my family for caring enough to insist I get help, even though it was difficult for everyone. Then I began sharing what I'd actually discovered. I talked about how I'd learned to recognize the difference between healthy assertiveness and problematic aggression. I explained that standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and asking for basic consideration weren't signs of anger issues. They were signs of healthy self-respect. I described the documentation I'd been keeping and the patterns I'd noticed. how conflicts consistently got reframed as being about my attitude rather than the actual issues at hand, how I was held to different standards than other family members, how my normal emotional responses were pathologized while others' genuinely problematic behavior was excused. I could see my parents starting to shift uncomfortably as I spoke. But I wasn't done. I addressed my sister-in-law directly, speaking calmly and factually. I outlined the pattern of provocative comments followed by victim playing. I described how she'd systematically worked to turn my parents against me while positioning herself as the wrong party. I explained how her behavior had created a toxic dynamic where I couldn't win no matter how I responded. The room was dead silent. My sister-in-law had gone pale and was staring at her hands. My brother looked like he was seeing his wife clearly for the first time in years. Dr. Chun then spoke about how these dynamics can develop unconsciously in families under stress, and how they can be changed once everyone recognizes them. She emphasized that healing would require acknowledgement from everyone, not just continued focus on my supposed problems. My father was the first to speak. He asked Dr. Chun if she was saying they'd been wrong about me having anger issues. She explained that while I'd certainly been angry, my anger had been a completely normal response to an abnormal situation. She said that in 3 years of therapy, she'd never observed signs of an actual anger management problem. My mother started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd become accustomed to, but genuine distress as she realized what had been happening. She looked at me and said she was sorry, that she'd had no idea she'd been making things worse instead of better. My brother confronted his wife right there in the session. He asked her why she'd been saying things to make me look bad when she knew I'd been nothing but helpful with their daughters. He wanted to know if what I described was true. My sister-in-law finally broke down and admitted it. She said she'd felt threatened by my presence in the house because it highlighted how little her husband was contributing. She'd been afraid my parents would start comparing their children and find her husband lacking. So she decided to make me the problem instead. She admitted to deliberately provoking arguments, misrepresenting my words and actions to my parents, and working to isolate me within the family. She said she'd convinced herself it was justified because she was protecting her family's interests, but sitting in that therapist's office, she could see how wrong she'd been. The session ended with my family finally understanding what had really been happening for the past 3 years. Dr. Chun recommended family therapy if we wanted to rebuild healthy relationships, but she made it clear that I was not the patient anymore. We all were. Update 1. The aftermath of that session was intense. My family spent the next week in what I can only describe as shock. My parents kept apologizing and asking how they could have been so blind. My brother was furious with his wife, and they had several explosive arguments about her manipulation and his complicity in it. My sister-in-law tried to minimize what she'd admitted to, claiming she'd been overwhelmed and desperate. But the damage was done. My family had heard the truth from her own mouth, and there was no walking it back. 2 weeks after the session, my brother came to me with a proposal. He'd finally gotten serious about job hunting after his wife's manipulation was exposed, and he'd landed an interview for a position in another state. If he got the job, they'd be moving out within a month. He got the job. As they packed their belongings, my sister-in-law tried to apologize to me privately. She said she knew she'd been wrong and hoped someday I could forgive her. I told her I appreciated the apology, but forgiveness would take time, and it would depend on whether she actually changed her behavior or just got better at hiding it. After they moved out, the house felt peaceful for the first time in years. My parents and I began rebuilding our relationship through family therapy sessions. It was difficult work. They had to confront how easily they'd been manipulated and how much damage their favoritism had caused. I finally saved enough to move into my own apartment 6 months after that final session with Dr. Chun. By then, my relationship with my parents was stronger than it had been in years. We'd learned to communicate directly instead of through triangulation and manipulation. Update 2. It's been 2 years since that final therapy session, and the changes in my family have been remarkable. My parents and I now have weekly dinners where we actually talk about real things instead of walking on eggshells around manufactured drama. My brother and I have slowly started rebuilding our relationship too. He called me 6 months after they moved to apologize for his role in everything. He admitted he'd known his wife was exaggerating and manipulating situations, but he'd gone along with it because it was easier than confronting her or taking responsibility for his own shortcomings. He's been in individual therapy working on his tendency to avoid conflict and let others fight his battles. His marriage survived, but barely, and only after his wife agreed to extensive counseling to address her manipulative behaviors. The most satisfying part isn't the vindication, it's the peace. I can visit my parents without bracing for drama. I can have conversations with my family without constantly analyzing whether I'm being too aggressive or not assertive enough. I can just be myself. Dr. Chun was right about something she told me in that final session. She said that sometimes the person a family labels as the problem is actually the healthiest member, the one who refuses to enable dysfunction and insists on calling out what's really happening. I spent 3 years thinking I was broken and needed fixing. It turns out I was the only one in my family who was functioning normally. I just needed to learn to trust my own perceptions instead of letting others define my reality for me. The best revenge wasn't exposing my sister-in-law's manipulation, though that was certainly satisfying. The best revenge was reclaiming my sense of self and building the healthy relationships I deserved. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be the scapegoat anymore. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.